The Philippines has a pretty big transitional justice problem, and I think it's very important for us to talk about it, especially this year, because this year is going to mark the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law in 1972 by President Marcos, and we may have another President Marcos coming up soon. So I think it'll be very difficult to actually talk about these things over the next few months, especially. But because it's difficult to talk about, I think we must talk about it. Before I start, I want to say that this idea of transitional justice is not going to be just about the Marcoses, it's about all the presidents that we've had since then as well, including Aquino, Ramos, Estrada, Arroyo, Duterte especially. All of this stuff is going to continue to be an issue over the next several decades. And we need to start at some point because we haven't really made any progress from the Marcos administration. So, we have to figure all of this stuff out soon so that we can eventually catch up to talking about how we can get transitional justice for the next administrations as well. Unfortunately, it's a big problem here. What is transitional justice anyway, right? I guess you want to know what that is first before you can actually say if the Philippines can have it at some point. This notion of transitional justice is a fairly recent one, and it probably first stems in the post-World War II Nazi Germany and Japan, who I guess internationally they lost the war, and so there was a sense that maybe they had done the most bad. I mean, Nazi Germany, of course, with killed there many millions and millions of people died, and Germany and Japan had their own version of that as well around Asia especially. And so for those two nations specifically, they had these international tribunals, military tribunals, where there's an internationally composed group of judges who had very publicized trials. In Germany it was the Nuremberg Trials, and I forgot what it was called in Japan, but people pretty much high up in the infrastructure of the government had to face trials for what was considered abuses of human rights, and many of them got sentenced. Some of them were executed. Some of them committed suicide before they could even really get to that point. And the idea of this kind of measure, these trials, was that in order to move on from this very horrific past, one must first acknowledge it, apologize for it, make reparations for it, which includes maybe jailing the people who were involved or executing them, and then at some point, helping the families of the victims of this period of time. And eventually also to reform the state so that it will not recur again. And so this idea of transitional justice as a way to make society better, make society more peaceful, make the transition of a country from a dictatorship to a democracy, or from whatever form of government to a democracy, to make that transition peaceful, longer lasting, and I guess in a way healthier of sorts. And around the world, since World War II, there have been other places that have tried having these transitional justice measures. So for example, in Chile, the Pinochet's dictatorship from 1973 to 1990 was also filled with lots of violence, and so during the 90s they had their own truth commission done in order to understand the facts of what happened and find people responsible for them, punish those people, and give reparations for the people who were victimized during that period of time, or the families of those who were victimized. The same thing happened as well in Taiwan in the 1990s. So in Taiwan, from 1949 to 1987, there was a military dictatorship led by Chiang Kai-shek and his son Chiang Ching-kuo. And after the dictatorship ended in 1987, the party that was leading the country, the KMT, continued to be in power, and it was a big step. The first step towards eventual reconciliation about that period of time started in the mid-90s when Lee Teng-hui, the president and leader of the KMT, officially apologized for what is called the 228 incident, or the thing that the massacre of sorts that was one of the reasons that they established a dictatorship in the country, or one of the reasons that it eventually led to that point. It doesn't matter, the details are not as important right now, but the point is that there are certain events in history that have led to establishments of dictatorships that have been filled with violence, and so usually those things are looked at first, and then eventually they lead on to looking at the dictatorship more generally. Other forms of transitional justice around the world have happened, say for example in South Africa after apartheid, In the 90s, I think Nelson Mandela may have led it. Trying this kind of like a truth commission again to find out exactly why apartheid was there, who were responsible for exacerbating the issues, and all of that stuff. Other forms of transitional justice don't have anything to do with government transition itself. But for example, in Canada and Australia, they're having these like reparative measures done for the indigenous communities because of the acknowledgement that when they were occupying those lands, there was a lot of violence done as well towards those people, the indigenous people, which again, as you probably know, is a problem pretty much around the world. But in Canada, Australia, they've been trying to do it, especially to really, again, move on from that, hopefully. The US has their own form with slavery. And again, like different countries around the world have been trying to do this like way to establish a healthier democracy, a healthier a more satisfied, I guess, people in general by acknowledging state-sponsored violence, finding ways to make it amenable as much as they can possibly do so, and then moving on from that so that they can just have a better system going forward. The problem is that in the Philippines, we never had this happen. So for those who maybe have forgotten, from the Declaration of Martial Law in 1972 up to 1987, Ferdinand Marcos had this kind of military dictatorship thing going on, and after Marcos and his family fled, after the People Power Revolution, they went to Hawaii, and the new presidency, I guess it was 1986 or 87, the presidency, 87, February 87, the new president, Aquino, kind of led the government into the next 6 years. But the problem was that during her administration, they did not really hold anyone accountable for what happened during that dictatorship period. And in the succeeding administrations, state-sponsored violence towards civilians continued to happen. In fact, during the early years of the Aquino administration especially, it was extremely bad. There had lots of these salvagings where they had very many extrajudicial killings of people who were associated with the political left, which continues to this day as well. And for example, right now, there's lots of state-sponsored violence, for example, towards people who are associated with, say, drug use in the Philippines under Duterte. And this is also something that will eventually, at one point in the future, will require some kind of transitional justice thing as well. Whenever there's a government, if it ever happens, when there's a government that is a bit more open to being critical about Duterte's administration. But this is an issue, again, that happens in every single presidency where because of the way the Philippines is such a weak democracy, the government has a lot of leeway to do things that maybe would not go over very well in other countries where the democracy is stronger, the government, the ability to see what the government is doing is more transparent and all that stuff. But the Philippines is unfortunately not a very strong, not a very well put together state of sorts, to put it mildly. And so abuses of power from the government continue to happen, and violence, state-sponsored violence especially, is an issue that will hopefully stop at some point, but it's a big issue in the Philippines. Now, when the government transitioned from Marcos to Aquino, one of the biggest reasons why they didn't really end up doing anything about the people who were culpable in many of the state-sponsored violence during the administration was because many of them continued on to hold their positions or to be in government during the Aquino administration. Let me repeat that. Many of the people who were culpable in the violence, state-sponsored violence during the Marcos administration, continued to have power during the Aquino administration, continued to have power during the Ramos administration, Estrada, Arroyo, and so forth. In fact, Fidel Ramos, the president after Cory Aquino, was the person who headed the police, I think, during martial law. So a lot of the actual implementation of martial law, a lot of the violence, probably, he's probably very, very culpable in all of this stuff because he was the person in charge. And that same person became the president of the country. So how can you realistically expect a country to really be able to look into its past with clarity and have transitional justice, when the people who would theoretically be implementing the measures for transitional justice are the same people who were culpable in the violence as well and continue to be culpable in a lot of state-sponsored violence. Many of the people who were part of the Marcos administration, that I think is, we don't talk about it enough, many of the things that people look at is like the problems of the administration, the problems of corruption, the problems of monopolies. Many of those people continued to exercise power and influence in society in the decades since martial law ended. Marcos fled to Hawaii and at some point a few years later died. And so the idea of having Marcos himself apologizing for some of these things is just not a possibility anymore. So people have moved on to saying, well, maybe his family should officially apologize for it, which I think is a realistic thing to desire, or not realistic, but it's like an understandable thing for people to want. But it's also important to think about how many other people, some of the same people who were calling for the apologies of the Marcoses, were very much culpable as well in the degradation of Philippine society during that period of time. And this is something we really need to look into, because who else will look into it really if the government itself is not who can check the government when so many of the people who are a part of what would theoretically check the government were actually people who are also involved in many of the problems in Philippine society. So for example, maybe you want to say like, well, look at the media industries. Some people say that the media should be the ones that check the government, but if you look into the money behind our local media, a lot of the people involved in that are very much a part of the same class of people who benefited or who were a part of the system that made society very bad in the country, or it kind of aggravated many of the ills of the country, whether it's wealth inequality or just all of this stuff. Like I don't know, it's complicated, because this idea of transitional justice, again, we can say, can it be expanded from president to president, where each president will apologize for the past president's things and then find ways to check the past so that they can find a way to move on to the next presidency with some kind of vibrancy, because they would have this understanding that that they are aware that things were not necessarily the best in the past, and so they want to transition into a system, into a better form of democracy where those people were held accountable, and then now ideally the current president will not anymore want to do any of those things. Now, if you look at the campaign of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte, one of the things that they're trying to present is this idea of unity, of like wanting to unify the country. That's the kind of the impression they're trying to give off. And there's no other better way to unify a country that has gone through so much state-sponsored violence than to have some sort of, just transitional justice measures done. And I think of all the people who would be able to best express that message, it would be Bongbong Marcos. He's the person, he holds the key to getting us out of all of this stuff, or at least transitioning us to having a better democracy, if he just genuinely puts in measures to acknowledge and make people accountable during the previous administrations. But the thing is that he's not going to do that, unfortunately. I don't think he will, because like I talked about earlier, he is probably also accountable. He's liable as well. And it's difficult because, like, when you think of, well, how can we ever find someone or a president or a group of people who are not stained by the blood of being terrible people, or being terrible politicians, or being terrible businessmen, or being a big part of destroying our society? How can we actually have any kind of transitional anything, justice towards anything, when the people, again, who hold the ability to actually have some kind of justice in place are the same people who are at fault? it's a weird conundrum, and I don't know. Hopefully, we can figure it out sometime soon.